Hey everyone, this is Jessica with K&A Greenhouse. This is one of two presentations I have available about hydrangeas. This one is going to go over the smooth hydrangeas, big leaf hydrangeas, and the mountain hydrangeas. The second one that I have available is about the panicle hydrangeas, oak leaf hydrangeas, and the climbing hydrangeas. So this basically just kind of goes over the different varieties that are available, how to prune them, because I get a lot of questions about how to prune people's hydrangeas in their homes when the appropriate time is, and about how far back to go. So hopefully this presentation helps you out if you have any of these hydrangeas or are even just thinking about putting some of them in your landscape. Okay, the first type of hydrangea that I'll be talking about is the smooth hydrangea or Hydrangea arborescens. This one is probably the hardiest hydrangea in Wisconsin. They bloom very reliably here in this area, so you don't have to worry about, um, I'll talk about it later, but some of the macrophyllus don't necessarily bloom very reliably. So these will, as long as they're in a happy spot, they'll bloom very reliably for you. Older varieties, they tend to flop after it rains because the flower heads are just so huge that the stems cannot keep them upright. Some of the newer varieties are better at keeping the flowers held aloft versus flopping down on the ground. And all of the flower heads on the arborescens are either a lace cap or round. Most of them are actually going to be a rounded flower head. These also will be a little bit taller than some of the other ones. They'll generally reach 4 to 6 feet tall and 4 to 6 feet wide. A lot of times, especially with something like the Annabelle, they spread by the roots. So they'll be, 6 feet, even sometimes 7 to 8 feet wide if you don't keep them from getting too huge. But generally speaking, 4 to 5 feet tall. My Annabelles are, I'd say, about 7 years old now, and they're probably about 4 to 4.5 feet tall. They are jugloan tolerant, so this is one of the hydrangea types you can plant if you have a walnut or a butternut tree, which is great news for me, as if you've watched any of my other presentations, I have quite a few walnut trees, so I'm always looking for something that will grow underneath the walnut trees. And then these can handle a fair amount of shade, so I do have mine under a very large walnut tree. And they basically get dappled sun, but no more than 2 hours of full sun every day, and they just grow just fine. They can handle partial sun, and I've seen some people put them on the south or west side of their homes. They do okay as long as they get enough water, but generally speaking, part sun to full sun is usually best for the smooth hydrangea varieties. In terms of pruning the Hydrangea arborescens, a lot of people like to leave the dried flower heads up through the winter just to have some sort of winter interest, especially because, as we know, winter tends to last sometimes 6 or 7 months here in Wisconsin. So it's nice that you can just leave those up over the winter. When they leaf out in the spring, they will leaf out from last year's branches. However, if you do prefer to just kind of give them a real big haircut, I every other year tend to prune them to about 6 to 8 inches above the ground, and then they'll just sprout up from the root system. Um, and every other year I don't do that. I'll just cut the flower heads off and leave the branches up. I've also heard a lot of people have started kind of picking and choosing which old growth to leave up, or they'll only cut it to about 12 to 18 inches above the soil instead, because that will actually give the new stems something to lean on. So, when they come up, they grow and then they flower. As I said, they get kind of floppy sometimes. But if the old growth from the previous years is still there, it gives them something to lean on that's a little more natural looking than like some of the stakes you can see very well from you step back from the garden, you can still see all the stakes and the ribbon and ties that you have to use to keep those plants up. So it's nice to have something for the new growth to lean on and keep them from flopping on the ground. For these, like with the panicle hydrangeas, you should try to cut them where the leaf nodes are. With the arborescens, you do not have to do that. You can just use a hedge trimmer if you want to, and just kind of give them a haircut if that's your preference. All right, so Annabelle is the first one we are going to go over here. This one is probably the arborescence variety that most people are familiar with. It's been on the market for a very long time. I mean, I remember it back when I was an intern in college, and that was more than 5 years ago. So it's been on the market for a very long time. You can see here in the photo, the flowers are white. They're kind of globe shaped or rounded. Um, the I would say these actually do make a fairly decent hedge if you're okay, not having a lot of privacy in the winter, just because once the leaves and the flower heads are gone, you don't really get a lot of privacy. But they do make a nice hedge. As you can see here, they flower quite a bit, so you do get that nice pop of color, especially if you have. I know a lot of people are starting to go more with like blue or even black for their siding on their homes, so that would definitely pop the color there. Um, like I said before, my Annabelle is about 4.5 feet tall after being in the ground for, I would say, 6, 7 years. It can get up to 6 feet tall, and it'll probably spread anywhere between 4 and 6, or even wider if you don't go ahead and cut out those wayward root systems that like to spread a little bit wider. No real fall color with the Annabelles, but the white flowers will last for a couple of months, and then you have those dried flower heads for something even in fall and the winter interest. And the Incredible series is newer on the market. The original Incredible, you can see on the left-hand side, has a very, very large flower. It's actually larger than what the Annabelle flowers will be. So you get even that much more of that color pop in your landscape. The Incredible also has a little bit thicker stems. So the flower heads, when it's younger, will still flop. But once it gets old enough, if you leave those older branches on there, it will definitely be able to hold up those huge flower heads on there. Incredible is supposed to be 4 to 5 feet tall and 4 to 5 feet wide. I have a couple of them underneath a bunch of walnut trees in my backyard. Um, they've only been on the ground for 2 years though, so I don't know if this one spreads quite as much as Annabelle. From what I've heard from customers, they tend to be a little bit more well behaved than the Annabelles. They won't sucker so much like the Annabelles do, which is another selling point. But like I said, I don't have any personal experience with that just yet. Got to give them a few more years to see what they decide to do. On the right hand side, you'll see Incredible Blush, which is a very pale pink color. It's still very pretty, and it still has the huge flowers on it, just like the original Incredible does. This one I don't have in my gardens, but I've heard a lot of other people say that they really do like this one just because it's a different color than white. If you're not really a big fan of white in your gardens, you can definitely go with this pink, and then you still get those 2 months of flowering. Both of these, the Proven Winner site says full sun to part shade. We generally sell them in our shade area in the nursery yard. And like I said, I have them underneath a bunch of my walnut trees in the backyard. They get zero sun other than the, dappled sun between the leaves every now and again. And they seem to be doing just fine in full shade. So my assumption is it's actually a full sun to full shade plant. If you do decide to plant them in full sun, just know that you'll probably end up having to water them quite a bit the first couple of years until they get established. Hydrangeas, generally speaking, like a lot of water until they get established, and they'll let you know if they're not happy. They tend to wilt as soon as they're a little bit thirsty, so at least they're a good indicator plant of that. Another variety of the arborescence is the Invincible series. There are quite a few different types of Invincible. There's Wee White, Mini Mauvette, I believe there's a Limetta, and then these two that I have photographed here, the Invincible Ruby on the left-hand side and Invincible Spirit 2 on the right-hand side. There was at one point Invincible Spirit, which did not do that well. So Invincible Spirit 2 is the improvement. Both of these are varying shades of pink. If you want more of a ruby, kind of rosy pink color for flower, I would go with the Invincible Ruby. Invincible Spirit is more of that pale pink, like the Incredible is kind of a pale pink. So both of those will do really well. The other varieties that I listed, like the Wee White, Mini Mauvette, and the Limetta, they're only so-so with hardiness. They don't seem to really get established very well. A lot of my suppliers are starting to get away from supplying them to us just because they don't seem to do very well. They're not as robust as some of the other varieties of hydrangeas. So these two that I have pictured here, I have had in my landscape before. I've seen them on a lot of garden walks. They seem to do very well. So these two are the two that we'll be selling in our garden center this year. In terms of size, both of these will be 3 to 4 feet tall and wide. They run a little bit more than the Incrediballs are going to. The Invincible is more like a pink flowering Annabelle, basically. Um, and if they are very happy, if you have very rich soils or you fertilize quite a bit, they will be more like that 5 foot tall and 5 to 6 feet wide. So just keep that in mind. And this is another one too where no fall color, but the dried flower heads too do provide some of that fall interest and winter interest. And you do still get about 2 months of blooming with these two varieties. So as I said, the wee white and the limetta are not very robust types of arborescens. This variety is coming to us from Monrovia. It's their Seaside Serenade series. It's called Bar Harbor, and this one is also kind of a shorter version like the wee white and the limetta will be. So this is kind of our answer. If you wanted something that was a shorter white flowering, you didn't want an Annabelle that gets so huge, Bar Harbor is supposed to be 3, possibly 4 feet tall and the same width. It also is not supposed to run, so it'll clump in little areas in your garden for you. If you do wanted to make a hedge, you'd have to plant them a little bit closer together just because they do form that clump instead of running. But you get, when it first comes out, it's a lime green color, and then it changes over to the white, and then of course the brown dried flower heads once they're done flowering. This one tends to start flowering end of June, early July, and it'll go for about 2 months. And no real fall color on this one. Also with the Bar Harbor, I would strongly suggest to keep it in part shade to full shade. So if you have 4 hours or less of sun, or you can put it underneath trees like I do with a lot of my hydrangeas, that would definitely be a good option. If you put it in full sun, it tends to burn the leaves, get that brown dots on there or on the edges just because they don't get enough water until they get established. So it'll be a couple of years if you do continue to water it enough. First couple of years it might look a little ratty, a little stressed out, but once it gets established and you have it in full sun, it should be okay. And for these arborescens, all the arborescens I should note, are going to be a hardiness zone of zone 3. So definitely for a majority of Wisconsin, these plants will be great. Okay, so moving on to the Hydrangea macrophylla, or the big leaf hydrangea. These are probably the least hardy of the varieties that we would have here in Wisconsin. You always see these in magazines though, which is unfortunate because they do really well on the coasts. West Coast, they look gorgeous. On the East Coast, people can grow these with no problem whatsoever. And the flowers are going to be in your gardens for, 3, 4 months if you live in, Maine, something like that. So just here in Wisconsin, our seasons are really short, and that's kind of the big downfall of this particular hydrangea. Our winters are just a little bit too cold for them. A lot of times, winter is okay, but then we always have a spring where it fluctuates so much that because they flower on old wood, the flower buds actually freeze off, and then our customers have really nice green plants with 1 or 2 flowers or none at all. So a lot of people are trying to breed these now so that they flower on old and new wood. So at least we here in Wisconsin will get some sort of flower and color out of these plants. Size on these ranges, it depends on the variety. Some are as short as 1.5 feet tall or 2 feet tall. Others are going to reach up to 5 feet tall. It just depends on your site and it depends on the variety. These will oftentimes on the internet say full sun. I don't recommend to plant them in full sun. We also sell these in our shade area, so full shade to part shade. So again, 4 hours or less of sun seems to do really well for them. They may be a little bit more leggy if you put them in full shade, so just be aware of that the first couple of years. You can definitely prune them to keep them from flopping over too much. But with the macrophylla, the stems are a little bit thicker than like the old arborescens varieties, so the flower heads don't usually flop as much once they get themselves established, and the branches are thick enough to hold up those flowers. So the Endless Summer series, I'm sure a lot of people have heard about. Some of our customers have started calling them Endless Bummer instead of Endless Summer, just because the original ones that were being bred were supposed to be cold hardy for here in Wisconsin, and we were supposed to be able to see all these beautiful blue or pink flowers, and it didn't really work, so people got disappointed and basically bummed out. So with this series, they are doing a better job of breeding them now. The newer varieties will bloom on old and new wood. So even if the flower buds do freeze, in April or May when we get those cold snaps, those snows, it'll still end up flowering on the new growth. So that's the good news with those. We will not see the flowers as early as they would had the flower buds not have frozen off, but we still do get some flowers starting sometimes in July. Otherwise, it'll be an August, September flower period for these particular endless summer hydrangeas. So with these, again, most of the ones in the endless summer series will be 3 to 5 feet tall. There is a new one called Pop Star that I don't go over in this particular presentation, but I do have it in my new shrubs of 2023. So if you're interested in learning more about that one's a dwarf twist and shout. So it's a shorter plant. I talk about that one in that particular presentation. So in terms of pruning these, they're not as easy as the arborescents, just because a lot of times if you prune them too late, or even in the spring, you'll end up cutting off the flower heads for that growing season. So generally speaking, it's recommended to deadhead them like you would deadhead a perennial. And do that in August when the flower heads are starting to turn brown, or even September. You just want to make sure that you do it before the flower buds are set on the plant for the following season. So once the current flowers that you have turn brown, just cut off those dried flower heads, leave the rest of the plant up. And you can see here in this diagram here what the proper pruning is. The good cut is the one that you want to look for on the left hand side. Don't cut it too close to the bud, but don't leave a stump, because that stump above that leaf node will end up just being a dried twig, and you won't have any leaves or flowers or anything above that. So just make sure you get the pruning done ahead of time. If you do want to leave the flower heads up through the winter just for some winter interest, I would still recommend to just prune the dried flower heads off and leave the rest of the plant up. Okay, so in the Endless Summer series, we have Bloomstruck, which has been around for quite a while now. It's an improvement of the original Endless Summer. On this one, the flowers do depend on whatever your soil pH is. So if you have clay soil like we do here around Madison and where I live in Mount Horeb, you'll get that pink flower. If you have something more like a sandier soil, you'll probably end up with the blue, and somewhere in between, right around a 6 for pH, you're going to have more of a lavender purple colored flower. So the Bloomstruck also has, I don't know if you can see it in that bottom photo, but has kind of maroon purple branching also. So that kind of gives you, even when the flowers aren't up, you still have that for a little bit of interest. I have a friend in Appleton who used to buy every single plant that had a purple or maroon twig on it, just because she really liked the color. Because even when it wasn't flowering, there was just that little extra. Instead of just green, it was green with a little pop of that purple or maroon. And the Bloomstruck here in Wisconsin can get 3 to 5 feet tall and 3 to 5 feet wide. It is more of a clumper than it runs, so it's going to be not quite like the Annabelle. It'll stay pretty well located in the garden wherever you plant that. And for this one also, I would recommend full shade to part sun. I've seen quite a few people who put them in a full sun location, and they always have some sort of leaf scorch on it, just because it requires a lot of water if you put it in a full sun spot. Twist and Shout is another one that's in the Endless Summer series, and it's another one also that is dependent on soil pH. So the blue is something that you'll have if it's like a sandier soil. The purple that you see on the top right is going to be more right around that pH of 6, and then the pink coloration is what we'll see if it were planted at my house. This one is 3 to 4 feet tall, 3 to 5 feet wide. And as I said, there is one called Pop Star that's coming out this year from Bailey Nurseries that will be a little bit shorter. So if you like the lace cap flowers that this has, but you don't have the room for something that wide or that tall, definitely look into the Pop Star instead. And Summer Crush is another one in the Endless Summer series. This one is not reliant on soil pH for flower color. So this will always be that really bright, hot pink color, regardless of if you have clay soil or sandy soil or something in between. This one's been on the market for a few years. I want to say 2020 possibly, somewhere around 2020 or 21. But this one does flower a little bit more reliably here in our gardens at K&A Greenhouse. So this is one that I would look into if you really like the rounded flower heads of the macrophylla. You want a little bit shorter. This one's a 3 to 4 foot and 3 to 4 feet tall and wide. So you'll get that dark green leaves, as you can see in the photo, the hot pink flowers. Really makes a nice statement in your garden if that's if you have room for something that has a hot pink flower. Okay, Fire Island is one that's also in the Seaside Serenade series, like the Bar Harbor is. I have this one at my house, so it is walnut tolerant. Some of the other, like the Endless Summer series I have planted, and they're not walnut tolerant. They ended up dying after 2 seasons. But the Fire Island that was planted right by them is still, it's not tall. It's probably about, I would say, 12 to 18 inches tall and about the same width. But it did flower for me starting at the end of June, and it kept going for another 2 months. So the flower on this one too is really cool because it's white and then the edge is kind of scalloped and ruffled, and it has that kind of bright pink pop right at the edge. And this one, the flower color does not matter if you have sandy soil or clay soil. This is what the flower is going to look like regardless of what you have in your gardens. It's a little bit smaller too. The Fire Island is only supposed to be about 2 to 3 feet tall and 2 to 3 feet wide, so it's not quite as tall as the ones that are in the Endless Summer series. Personally, I have this one planted under a canopy of walnuts, so it gets full shade, does just fine. It might be a little bit taller if I do have it in more of a part sun location, but I don't have room in those gardens right now, so that's where it is in full shade. I would not plant this in full sun. When we had these out in a sunnier area in the nursery yard, the leaves started to change kind of maroon and brown because I believe that they were just too stressed out being in full sun. So once we put them back in the shade area, they were much happier. Leaves turned back to green. Much happier plant. Okay, so Grateful Red is one that comes to us from McKay Nursery here in Wisconsin. We do have these actually planted along our driveway at the Mineral Point Road location, and they have flowered for us pretty prolifically for the last 2, possibly 3, I think it was 2 seasons. So these are definitely hardier. If you're looking for, I mean, if you've tried the Summer Crush, you've tried the Bloomstruck, they just don't flower for you, I would definitely plant these instead because they do flower at the nursery yard for us. I have one of these at my house, and every time the flower buds come in there, I have a deer that thinks that they taste really great, and they just eat the flower buds off, but the rest of the plant they leave alone. So apparently the flowers on Grateful Red taste really good. So this one also is a little bit shorter than the Endless Summer series, 2 to 3 feet tall, 2 to 3 feet wide. And then the flowers are not really dependent on soil pH, only a little bit depending. Like clay soils will have this bright pink. If you have more of the sandier soils, it will be more of kind of like a purplish pink instead of that bright hot pink color. And Cherry Explosion is another one that we're getting from McKay Nursery here in Wisconsin. This is the lace cap type flower, so you'll have the little tiny florets in the center with the larger florets along the outside. This one doesn't bloom quite as prolifically as the Grateful Red does, but it still does bloom reliably for us here in Wisconsin. This is another one that I have at my house. It used to be underneath a maple tree, and then we had to have the maple tree cut down, so now it's in full sun, and actually last year it was not that happy, so I definitely need to move it out of a full sun location. It was quite happy, and it kept flowering for about 2 months for me when it was underneath that maple canopy. The flower color on this one does not get affected by soil pH, so it will always be this bright rosy pink color. Height and width on this one is 3 to 4 feet tall and wide. So this one's a little bit bigger than the Grateful Red that we get from McKay's as well. And the last type of hydrangea I will be talking about in this presentation are the mountain hydrangeas. These are actually listed as a zone 5, but I've been able to grow them at my house. And where I have them at my house, they're on one side of the house that is a zone 5, and then the other part I have them planted is actually down closer to the woods. So that is generally speaking a zone 4 area on my property. So I think they're just a little bit hardier possibly than they may be listed as right now. The mountain hydrangeas are all going to have that lace cap flower. Just depends on which variety, but they'll have different colors. And then because they're a shorter plant, they also have thicker stems and they tend to hold the flower heads up. You really won't see them flopping over all that much, after it rains or anything like that. So as I said, they're a little bit shorter. They tend to be between 1 and 3 feet tall, with about the same width. And these also are tolerant of my walnut trees, so this is another one that you can definitely plant if you have walnut trees around your property or butternut trees around your property. The flowers on these are on old wood. However, I only get the tough stuff, and you can see in my notes here, the tough stuff series, they bloom on old and new wood. So that is the series that I generally only get in just because it's a little bit better for what we have here weather-wise in Wisconsin. Pruning these is very similar to the Hydrangea macrophylla. You can prune them all the way down to about 6 inches above the soil, but just know that you'll only get the flowers that are going to flower on the new wood in the next season. If you want to try and get them so that they flower on old and new wood, which will extend your blooming, how many months it blooms, you would just want to go ahead and cut those dried flowers off once they're basically brown. So when they change from either that lavender, pink, or blue color to the brown, then you can go ahead and just deadhead those flowers. And then in theory, you'll be able to get the flowers on the old wood first, and then you'll get some on the new wood the following season. But it does depend on what kind of winter we have and what kind of spring we have. If we get those fluctuating 30 and then 55 and then 25, you might still get those flower buds that get frozen off, and then you'll just have flowers on the new growth. So as I said, I generally only get in the Tough Stuff series for the mountain hydrangea. They seem to be a little bit hardier. They seem to flower a little bit better here in Wisconsin. They all have the lace cap flowers. As I said, the flower color is dependent on soil pH. So here again in this area of Wisconsin with the clay soils, we will probably pretty much only have the pink flowers. If you have a soil pH right around 6, you'll get a purplish blue or lavender color. And then if you have sandier soils, you'll get more of that blue for the flower colors. The tiny tough stuff is probably our best selling mountain hydrangea just because it's so small. The tiny tough stuff is generally going to be 1.5 to 2 feet tall and the same width. The tough stuff and the tough stuff red are going to be slightly taller, so 2 to 3 feet tall and 2 to 3 feet wide. And actually all of these, I know a lot of people tend to look for plants that they can put into containers. This would be a good option too, just because they're so small. You can see in the top photo there, that is the tiny tough stuff, and that one is being grown in a container. You just have to make sure that you water it a little bit more often because there's less soil there, so the plant is going to be taking up a lot more water a lot more quickly. So that is everything I have for you in this presentation. If you have questions or you have comments for me, feel free to email me at kandagreenhouse@gmail.com, or you can call me or text me at my work phone number, which is 920-415-4474. I hope this was helpful for you, and like I said, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer anything for you. Thanks so much.